Deep in the Washington logging trails, the line between man and beast is written in blood. Serena thought she was saving a dying timber wolf from a poacher's snare. She never expected to wake up to a heavily scarred, fiercely protective billionaire bleeding on her living room rug or the deadly pack hunting him. The rain in the Pacific Northwest didn't just fall. It seeped into the marrow of your bones. Serena Hayes, a 28-year-old senior wildlife biologist for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, wiped the freezing drizzle from her brow as she navigated the dense underbrush of the Hoh rainforest. It was late November, and the woods just outside Port Angeles were unforgiving, cloaked in a perpetual, eerie twilight. Serena was miles off the designated trails, tracking a GPS signal from a collared cougar that had gone unnervingly still for the past 12 hours. Her boots crunched over decaying pine needles and snapped twigs, the only sounds piercing the heavy silence of the forest. Then, she heard it. It wasn't a roar, nor was it the typical frantic whining of a trapped animal. It was a low, resonant vibration, a growl so deep it rattled the damp earth beneath her soles. Serena unholstered her tranquilizer dart gun, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pushed through a thick curtain of ferns and froze. In a small clearing, surrounded by ancient, towering Douglas firs, lay a beast unlike anything Serena had ever documented in her 8 years of fieldwork. It was a wolf, but the proportions were staggeringly wrong. The animal was massive, easily tipping the scales at over 200 pounds, with a thick coat as black as a starless night. But it was the situation, not just the size, that made Serena's breath hitch. The wolf's right hind leg was caught in the jagged, rust-covered jaws of an illegal, heavy-duty bear trap. The steel teeth had bitten deep into muscle and bone. The surrounding moss stained a sickening dark crimson. "Hey there," Serena whispered, her voice trembling despite her training. "Easy, big guy. I'm not going to hurt you." Normally, a wild predator in absolute agony would thrash wildly, snapping its own bones in a desperate bid for freedom, or it would lunge at any approaching threat. This wolf did neither. As Serena took a slow, agonizing step forward, the creature lifted its massive head, its eyes locked onto hers. They weren't the yellow or amber eyes of a typical timber wolf. They were a piercing, luminous silver, filled with an intelligence that made the hairs on Serena's arms stand at attention. The beast didn't bare its teeth. It simply watched her, its gaze heavy with a strange, stoic endurance. It was as if it was assessing her intent. "You're losing a lot of blood," Serena murmured, keeping her movements deliberately slow. She lowered the tranquilizer gun. If the animal was already in shock, a heavy sedative could stop its heart entirely. She needed to release the trap and stem the bleeding, fast. She retrieved a heavy canvas tarp and her medical kit from her pack. Approaching a wounded predator of this size was practically a death wish, but Serena's instinct to heal overrode her survival reflex. She knelt beside the massive animal. Up close, the musky scent of pine, rain, and raw copper filled her senses. The wolf let out a ragged breath but remained perfectly still as Serena examined the trap. It was a brutal piece of black market hardware, chained to a deeply rooted stump. "I have to pry this open. It's going to hurt," she said softly, absurdly feeling the need to explain herself to the animal. She wedged a sturdy steel pry bar from her kit into the jaws of the trap. With a grunt of exertion, Serena threw her entire body weight against the bar. The rusted springs groaned in protest. The wolf let out a sharp, guttural sound, a mix between a snarl and a whimper, but remarkably, it snapped its jaws around a thick piece of deadwood rather than Serena's arm, biting down to endure the pain. With a final, violent crack, the steel jaws parted just enough. Serena yanked the wolf's mangled leg free. The animal immediately collapsed onto its side, panting heavily, its silver eyes fluttering shut as exhaustion and blood loss took over. "Stay with me," Serena pleaded. She quickly wrapped the deep lacerations in thick gauze, applying brutal pressure to the severed artery. She couldn't leave it here. The cold and blood loss would kill it before midnight. Using every ounce of adrenaline coursing through her veins, Serena rolled the massive, limp body onto her heavy-duty transport sled. The 2-mile hike back to her custom Jeep Wrangler on the logging road was a blur of burning muscles and frantic desperation. By the time she reached her isolated cabin on Oakhaven Road, which doubled as a private, fully equipped veterinary clinic, the storm had escalated into a full-blown tempest. Serena hoisted the wolf onto the stainless steel examination table. For 3 hours under the harsh fluorescent lights, she worked. She cleaned the torn muscle, stitched the jagged flesh, and injected a heavy dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics and a mild painkiller. Finally, she wrapped the massive leg in layers of sterile dressing, securing it with a distinctive, bright pink, cohesive bandage, the only color she had left in her supply cabinet. She moved the sedated giant into the heavy-duty recovery enclosure, a reinforced steel cage meant for bears. Locking the heavy deadbolt, Serena finally allowed herself to collapse into a nearby armchair. Her clothes were soaked in rain and blood. Her hands were shaking violently. She stared at the sleeping beast, its chest rising and falling in a steady, reassuring rhythm. "What are you?" she whispered to the empty room. Exhaustion pulled her under before she could find an answer. Serena woke with a violent jolt. Her neck was stiff, and the harsh morning light filtering through the clinic's frosted windows stung her eyes. For a disorienting second, she forgot why she was sleeping in her scrub shirt in the clinic armchair. Then, the smell of antiseptic and dried blood hit her, and the memories of the colossal black wolf flooded back. She sat up quickly, her eyes darting to the reinforced recovery enclosure. Her breath caught in her throat. The heavy steel door wasn't just open, it was destroyed. The thick hinges were sheared clean off, and the locking mechanism was bent outward, as if a stick of dynamite had gone off from the inside. "No," Serena breathed, panic seizing her chest. The cage was empty. She scrambled to her feet, her boots slipping slightly on the linoleum floor. She grabbed the heavy tranquilizer rifle from the wall mount, loading a dart with trembling fingers. A 200-pound, terrified, and injured apex predator was loose in her house. "Hey," Serena called out softly, her voice shaking. "Hey, big guy." She tracked the evidence. A trail of smeared blood led out of the clinic and down the narrow hallway toward her living room. But as Serena followed the trail, a cold dread began to pool in her stomach. The crimson smears on the hardwood floor started as large, distinct paw prints, but halfway down the hall, the shape of the prints began to change. They elongated. The pads shifted. By the time the blood trail reached the threshold of her living room, they were no longer paw prints. They were the distinct, bloody footprints of a very large, bare-footed human man. Serena froze, the heavy rifle suddenly feeling useless in her hands. Her mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Someone broke in. A poacher tracked the wolf, broke the cage, stole the animal, and left a bleeding accomplice behind. It was the only logical, scientific conclusion. She gripped the rifle tighter and stepped into the living room. The fireplace was dead, the room freezing. Lying on his back on her antique Persian rug was a man. He was completely naked, his body a map of heavily corded muscle and a terrifying network of both ancient, silvery scars and fresh, violent bruising. He was breathtakingly handsome in a rugged, almost brutal way, with sharp cheekbones and dark, disheveled hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. But it was his right leg that made Serena drop the tranquilizer rifle. It clattered against the floorboards with a deafening thud, wrapped tightly around the man's right calf and thigh, perfectly intact and exactly where she had placed it on the wolf the night before, was the bright pink cohesive bandage. Blood was slowly seeping through the neon fabric. "This is impossible," Serena whispered, stepping back until her spine hit the doorframe. "I'm having a psychotic break." The stress finally cracked me. At the sound of the dropping rifle, the man shifted. A low groan rumbled from deep within his chest, a sound that was terrifyingly identical to the vibration she had felt in the forest. His eyes snapped open. Serena gasped. They were the same eyes, piercing, luminous silver, staring right through her. The man slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, wincing as his hand brushed the pink bandage. He looked around the cozy, rustic living room, taking in the overflowing bookshelves, the dying embers in the fireplace, and finally, Serena, who was hyperventilating by the doorway. "Pink?" His voice was a raspy, deep baritone that commanded the space. "Who are you?" Serena demanded, her voice shrill. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace stand, pointing it at him. Where is the wolf? How did you get in here? The man sighed, dragging a heavy hand over his face. Put the poker down, Serena. If I wanted to hurt you, you wouldn't have survived the night. How do you know my name? He gestured vaguely to the embroidered Department of Fish and Wildlife patch on her discarded jacket over the sofa. I can read. And I have an excellent memory. You have steady hands for a biologist. He looked down at his bandaged leg. The sutures are tight. You saved my life. You were the wolf, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She was a scientist. Biology, physics, reality, these were her religions. Men did not turn into wolves. Wolves did not turn into men. I am Alistair Sterling, he said simply, as if that explained everything. Serena's mind raced. Alistair Sterling. The name was famous across the Pacific Northwest. He was the elusive CEO of Sterling Global, a massive land development and logging conglomerate that owned hundreds of thousands of acres of private forest. He was a billionaire recluse, rarely photographed, known for his ruthless business tactics and aggressive conservation efforts on his own land. You're a billionaire, Serena blurted out, her brain failing to filter the absurdity of the situation. And you're naked on my rug. A faint, dangerous smirk played on his lips. I am, and I apologize for the intrusion, but we have a much more pressing issue than my lack of clothing. Alistair's silver eyes suddenly widened. He stopped breathing, his head tilting to the side as if listening to something Serena couldn't hear. The playful smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, predatory lethalness. They found me, he growled. Who? Serena asked, still gripping the iron poker. The men who set the trap. Alistair forced himself to his feet, gritting his teeth as weight settled onto his injured leg. He was towering, easily 6'4", casting a massive shadow across the room. He snatched a thick wool blanket from the back of her sofa and wrapped it securely around his waist. What are you talking about? Poachers don't track animals to people's houses, Serena argued. They aren't poachers, Serena. And I am not just an animal. Alistair limped rapidly toward the front window, peering through the blinds. Before Serena could demand another answer, the jarring crunch of heavy gravel echoed from her long private driveway. Serena lived 3 miles off the main road. She never got unexpected visitors. She rushed to the window beside Alistair. Cutting through the morning fog, moving with aggressive speed, were 3 black, unmarked SUVs. They slammed to a halt in her front yard, forming a tactical barricade blocking her Jeep. Doors flew open. A dozen men poured out into the rain. They weren't dressed like local hunters. They wore tactical black gear, and the dull metal of automatic weapons slung across their chests gleamed in the gray morning light. Oh my God, Serena choked out, stepping back from the window. I need to call Sheriff Miller. I need to call the police. Alistair grabbed her hand. His grip was searingly hot, like a physical brand against her skin. The police can't stop Gideon's men, Serena. If they come inside, they will kill you just for seeing my face. Gideon? Who is Gideon? A man who wants my territory, my company, and my head on a spike, Alistair said, his silver eyes flashing dangerously. You have a back door. Where does it lead? To the ravine, she stammered. It drops down into the state park trails. The sound of heavy boots pounding against her front porch echoed through the cabin. A violent, deafening pounding started on her heavy oak front door. Open up! State police! A voice bellowed from outside. They're lying, Alistair whispered, pulling her toward the kitchen. Grab your keys. We have to run. Now! The heavy oak front door of Serena's cabin splintered inward with a deafening crack, the sound swallowed by the roar of an automatic rifle tearing through the drywall. Serena didn't scream. Her training with unpredictable wildlife kicked in, replacing panic with cold, sharp adrenaline. She grabbed her bug-out bag from beneath the kitchen counter packed for forest fires, not paramilitary hit squads, and shoved her spare keys into her pocket. Through the mudroom, Serena barked, shoving open the swinging door. Alistair was right behind her, moving with a fluid, lethal grace that completely defied the horrific injury to his leg. He snagged a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stovetop as they passed. They burst out the back door just as heavy boots pounded into the kitchen behind them, The drop off the back deck led straight into a steep, treacherous ravine choked with slick mud, thorny blackberry bushes, and ancient bracken ferns. "Slide!" Serena yelled, throwing herself over the edge. They plummeted down the embankment, the icy rain slicking the mud into a natural chute. Thorny vines tore at Serena's waterproof jacket and Alistair's bare skin, but the billionaire didn't utter a single sound. Above them, men shouted, their flashlights cutting frantic white beams through the dense fog. "There! Down the ravine!" a voice bellowed. Bullets shredded the canopy above, raining pine needles and shattered bark down on them. Serena hit the bottom of the ravine hard, her boots sinking ankle-deep into the freezing muck. Before she could find her footing, Alistair grabbed her arm, hauling her up effortlessly. The heat radiating from his skin was staggering in the freezing rain. "Where is the secondary vehicle?" he demanded, his silver eyes scanning the dark, suffocating woods with unnatural clarity. "Half a mile north. An old logging shed off the decommissioned spur road." Serena gasped, her lungs burning. "I keep an old '88 Ford Bronco there for winter emergencies." "Run," he ordered. They tore through the underbrush. Serena knew these woods like the back of her hand, but Alistair was navigating the pitch-black forest without stumbling once, pulling her along, steering her away from hidden sinkholes and fallen logs she couldn't even see. When they finally broke through the tree line, the dilapidated corrugated metal shed loomed in the gray light. Serena fumbled with the rusted padlock, her fingers numb. She yanked the heavy doors open, revealing the boxy, faded red Bronco. "Get in," she ordered, tossing her bag into the back. Alistair climbed into the passenger seat, the wool blanket still wrapped securely around his waist, soaking wet and plastered to his massive frame. Serena twisted the key. The old V8 engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with a loud, aggressive growl. She slammed it into gear and tore down the overgrown logging road, running parallel to Highway 101 without turning her headlights on. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the roar of the heater and the violent slapping of the windshield wipers. When Serena finally merged onto a desolate stretch of the 101, heading east toward the Bainbridge Island ferry terminal, she let out a ragged breath. "Okay," Serena said, her voice shaking as she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. "You owe me an explanation, because my brain is currently trying to rationalize a mass hallucination, and I am a woman of science." Alistair leaned his head back against the worn fabric of the seat. The tension in his jaw was rigid. "Science only explains the world you are allowed to see, Serena. Don't give me cryptic billionaire philosophy," she snapped, shooting him a glare. "You were a wolf, a 200-pound timber wolf caught in a bear trap, and now you are a man. Explain it." Alistair turned his head, his silver eyes pinning her to her seat. "The Sterling family has owned the timberlines of the Pacific Northwest since the 1800s. We didn't buy the land for the lumber. We bought it for the isolation. My bloodline carries a genetic anomaly, a curse, a blessing, whatever you want to call it. We are lichens. Werewolves, if you prefer the Hollywood term." Serena scoffed, though the sound was hollow. "Werewolves. Right. And I'm the Queen of England. You pulled a steel trap off my leg, Serena. A trap laced with silver nitrate," Alistair said, his voice dropping an octave. "Standard steel would have shattered against my bones. The silver poisoned my bloodstream, forced me into my lupine form to conserve my cellular regeneration, and kept me paralyzed." Gideon said it. "Gideon? Gideon Cross," Alistair continued. "He runs a rival faction in the Cascades. He's a rogue alpha who believes humanity is a disease and that our kind should stop hiding. He wants to merge our packs by force. If he kills me, he takes my territory, my billions, and my people." Serena stared at the road ahead, her scientific mind desperately trying to categorize the information. Cellular regeneration, silver nitrate toxicity, genetic anomalies. It was insane, but she had seen the shift in the footprints. She had felt the weight of the beast. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice quieter. "We get to Seattle. I have a secure penthouse in Belltown," Alistair said, wincing as he shifted his leg. "I need to contact my beta, my second-in-command. He'll mobilize our security forces and crush Gideon's mutiny before it reaches the city." Serena glanced at his leg. The pink bandage was completely saturated with blood, but the bleeding seemed to have finally stopped. "Your leg. It needs a hospital." Alistair offered a grim, blood-stained smile. "Just get me to the city, Serena. I heal fast." The drive onto the Bainbridge ferry was a masterclass in paranoia. Serena parked the Bronco between two massive freight trucks on the lower deck to obscure them from view. Alistair stayed huddled in the shadows of the cab. By the time they reached the private parking garage of the towering glass and steel building in Belltown, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, reflecting blindingly off Puget Sound. Alistair entered a complex code into the private elevator. It shot up to the 42nd floor, opening directly into a sprawling, minimalist penthouse wrapped in floor-to-ceiling windows. "Wait here," Alistair commanded, limping toward the master suite. When he returned 10 minutes later, he was wearing a pair of dark tailored trousers and a crisp black dress shirt, looking every bit the ruthless CEO he was known to be on the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. "Sit," Serena ordered, pointing to a stark white leather sofa. "I need to check those sutures." Alistair raised an eyebrow but complied, rolling up the pant leg. Serena knelt, unwrapping the ruined pink bandage. As she pulled the final layer of gauze away, she gasped. The deep, jagged lacerations that had severed muscle and scraped bone just 14 hours ago were gone. In their place were thick, raised pink scars that were already fading to a dull white. "That's biologically impossible," Serena whispered, tracing the edge of the scar with a trembling, gloved finger. "I told you," Alistair said softly, his gaze dropping to watch her face. "I heal fast." For a moment, the silence in the penthouse was thick, heavy with an electric, unspoken tension. Serena looked up, her face inches from his. The primal intensity in his eyes was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the sterile, calculated world she lived in. The spell was shattered by the sharp chime of the private elevator. Alistair was on his feet in a fraction of a second, positioning himself between Serena and the doors. The brushed steel doors slid open, revealing a tall, impeccably dressed man holding a leather briefcase and a garment bag. He had slicked back blonde hair and wore a sharp Tom Ford suit. "Alistair," the man breathed, stepping out and visibly relaxing. "Thank God. When your tracker went dark in the Hoh rainforest, I thought the worst." "Silas," Alistair said, his shoulders dropping marginally. He turned to Serena. "This is Silas Montgomery, my chief operating officer, and my beta." Silas offered Serena a perfectly measured, corporate smile. "And you must be the woman who saved his life. The entire Sterling organization owes you a debt of gratitude, Miss Hayes." "Serena Hayes," she said cautiously, standing up. "Silas, I need a status report on Gideon," Alistair demanded, moving toward the kitchen island. "He ambushed us at Serena's cabin with a paramilitary team." "How did he know my patrol routes?" Silas set the briefcase on the glass coffee table, popping the brass latches. "It's worse than we thought, Alistair. Gideon has infiltrated the board. He's paying off the local law enforcement. I brought you a clean phone, a new passport, and enough cash to get you to the sanctuary in Vancouver." Serena watched Silas intently. Her job as a biologist required a hyper-awareness of micro-expressions and environmental inconsistencies. She looked at Silas's immaculate Italian leather Oxfords. The leather was pristine, except for the welt of the sole. Packed deeply into the stitching was a very specific, reddish-brown clay, Olympic Peninsula glacial till. It was distinct to the deep ravines of the Hoh rainforest, the exact mud she and Alistair had just slid through. "Wait," Serena said, her voice sharp. "Mr. Montgomery, when was the last time you were in Port Angeles?" Silas paused, his hand hovering over the open briefcase. "I haven't been to Port Angeles in months, Miss Hayes. Why do you ask?" Serena backed away slowly, her heart hammering. "Because that mud on your shoes doesn't exist in Seattle. It only exists on the logging trails near my cabin." Alistair froze. The air in the room suddenly seemed to drop 10 degrees. He slowly turned his head to look at his beta. "Silas." Silas's corporate smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reptilian sneer. He reached into the briefcase, but he didn't pull out a phone or a passport. He pulled out a heavy, suppressed tactical pistol, pointing it directly at Alistair's chest. The metal of the gun had a dull, sickeningly familiar sheen. Silver. "You always were too trusting of the people in suits, Alistair," Silas said, stepping back toward the elevator. "Gideon sends his regards. He thought you might survive the trap, but he knew you'd call me the second you hit the city. You sold out your own blood?" Alistair growled, his voice vibrating the glass windows. His eyes were no longer human. They were glowing, molten silver, and his jaw began to elongate, the sound of bones cracking and shifting filling the penthouse. "It's not personal. It's just a hostile takeover," Silas sneered. He hit a button on a remote in his pocket. The glass ceiling of the penthouse suddenly shattered inward. Thick, black, rappelling ropes dropped from a stealth helicopter hovering silently above the building. Half a dozen heavily armed men in black tactical gear crashed through the skylight, landing on the hardwood floor with terrifying precision. Silas aimed the silver-loaded gun at Serena's head. "Kill the Alpha, but bring the biologist to Gideon. He wants to know exactly how she broke his unbreakable trap." Alistair let out a roar that shattered the remaining windows, his human facade tearing away as the beast ripped free to protect the woman who had saved him. The transformation was an explosion of primal violence and terrifying biological restructuring. Serena threw her arms over her face as Alistair's custom dress shirt shredded into 1,000 pieces, his human skin giving way to an eruption of coarse, midnight black fur. The sound of his bones snapping, lengthening, and fusing together echoed over the deafening chop of the stealth helicopter's rotors outside the shattered skylight. This wasn't just the 200-pound timber wolf Serena had operated on in her clinic. Fueled by adrenaline, pure rage, and the unchecked power of his bloodline, the beast that stood between Serena and the tactical strike team was monstrous. He was easily 300 pounds of lethal muscle, his jaws lined with fangs the size of hunting knives. The silver eyes that had been so profoundly human moments ago were now glowing with a molten, predatory fury. "Open fire!" Silas screamed, scrambling backward over the broken glass, his composure completely shattered. The 6 mercenaries, clad in heavy Kevlar and dropping from the black tactical ropes, leveled their suppressed automatic rifles. The penthouse erupted into a chaotic symphony of shattering glass, splintering drywall, and the unmistakable, whistling thud of silver-jacketed rounds embedding themselves into the imported Italian furniture. Serena didn't freeze. The analytical, survivalist part of her brain, the same part that had kept her alive during a grisly charge in the Yukon 2 years prior, took the wheel. She threw herself behind the massive, marble kitchen island, dragging her heavy canvas bug-out bag with her. Above her, Alistair moved with a speed that defied physics. He wasn't just a brawler, he was a tactician. He didn't charge the firing line directly. Instead, he vaulted off a structural concrete pillar, launching himself 20 feet across the room and intercepting the first 2 mercenaries before their boots even hit the hardwood floor. Alistair's jaws clamped around the tactical vest of the closest man, lifting him effortlessly. With a vicious snap of his massive neck, he threw the mercenary through the remaining floor-to-ceiling windows. The man's scream faded rapidly as he plummeted 42 stories toward the concrete sidewalks of Elliott Avenue. "Spread out! Use the silver netting!" Silas barked from behind the safety of an overturned grand piano, firing his heavy pistol blindly into the fray. A silver bullet grazed Alistair's massive shoulder. The wolf let out a thunderous, earth-shaking roar that rattled the cutlery in the kitchen drawers. The smell of burning fur and seared flesh hit Serena's nose. The silver was reacting violently with his cells, burning him on a molecular level. Serena unzipped her bag with frantic, shaking hands. She couldn't fight werewolves with a tranquilizer dart, but she was a wildlife biologist. She spent her life deterring apex predators. Her fingers wrapped around the cold aluminum canister of her industrial-grade counter-assault bear deterrent, a highly pressurized, concentrated capsaicin spray designed to project a blinding cloud of agony up to 40 feet. She peered around the edge of the marble island. Alistair was systematically dismantling the strike team. He was a blur of black shadow and silver teeth, moving with an ancient, devastating grace. 3 men were down, their weapons crushed beneath his massive paws. But the remaining 2 mercenaries had managed to deploy a heavy, silver-threaded net from a launcher, trapping Alistair's hind legs. The wolf thrashed, his snarls vibrating the floorboards, but the silver mesh was burning into his flesh, weakening him. Silas saw his opening. Realizing the Alpha was temporarily grounded, the treacherous Beta turned his silver-loaded pistol away from the beast and pointed it directly at the marble island. He knew Alistair's weakness. "Say goodbye to the biologist, Alistair," Silas yelled, advancing on Serena's position with cold, calculated steps. "Gideon will be thrilled to know I tied up loose ends." Serena took a deep breath, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't cower. She waited until Silas's polished Italian leather Oxfords stepped within 15 feet of her position. Then, she stood up. Silas smirked, raising his pistol. "Smart girl. Nowhere to run." "I'm not running," Serena said coldly. She leveled the bear spray canister and pulled the safety trigger. A thick, violently orange cloud of concentrated pepper spray erupted from the nozzle at 60 miles per hour. It hit Silas directly in the face. For a human, the spray was blinding, suffocating agony. But for a lichen, with olfactory senses and mucous membranes 1,000 times more sensitive than a human's, it was absolute hell. Silas dropped his weapon instantly, clapping his hands over his face and screaming a high-pitched, inhuman howl of pure torment. He collapsed to his knees, clawing at his burning eyes, his body thrashing against the floor as his enhanced senses short-circuited entirely. The distraction was all Alistair needed. Ignoring the searing pain of the silver net, the massive black wolf surged forward. With a sickening crunch of metal and bone, he snapped the heavy cables of the net with his jaws. He lunged across the room, pinning the last 2 terrified mercenaries to the floor with an intimidating, bone-rattling growl that promised instant death if they twitched a single muscle. The men dropped their weapons, throwing their hands up in absolute surrender. The helicopter above, realizing the hit squad had been decimated, immediately banked hard to the west, retreating over the freezing, dark waters of Puget Sound. The penthouse fell eerily silent, save for the howling wind whipping through the shattered windows and Silas's pathetic, muffled wheezing on the floor. Alistair slowly turned his massive Lupizan head toward Serena. He was covered in blood, both his own and his enemies', and the silver burn on his shoulder was smoking faintly. Yet, as he looked at her, the feral, untamed violence in his silver eyes softened. He let out a low, rumbling huff that sounded remarkably like a sigh of relief. He stepped over the groaning Silas and approached Serena. For a terrifying second, she was acutely aware that she was standing toe-to-toe with a mythical monster. But as the wolf gently nudged his massive, blood-stained snout against her trembling hand, Serena felt no fear. She felt the same stoic, heavy presence she had recognized in the Washington woods. "It's okay," Serena whispered, her voice cracking as she ran a hand through his thick, dark fur. "You're safe now." Alistair pulled back, closing his eyes. The sickening, visceral sound of shifting bone and tearing tissue echoed through the room once more as he forced the change. Within seconds, the towering billionaire was back, kneeling on the glass-strewn floor, gasping for air. He was completely naked again, his chest heaving, his body littered with new, rapidly healing wounds. Serena immediately averted her eyes, feeling a sudden flush of heat in her cheeks. She grabbed a heavy velvet curtain that had been torn from its rod during the firefight and draped it over his shoulders. "Thank you," Alistair rasped, pulling the velvet tightly around his waist. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the ruined room. He walked over to Silas, who was still weeping blindly on the floor. Alistair grabbed the treacherous Beta by the collar of his ruined Tom Ford suit and hauled him to his feet. "You tell Gideon," Alistair growled, his voice vibrating with an unnatural, dual-toned resonance that made the remaining mercenaries whimper. "You tell him the ambush failed. You tell him that Alistair Sterling does not just hold the Pacific Northwest. I am the Alpha King of this coast. And if he ever sets foot on my territory again, I will tear his pack apart with my bare hands." Alistair shoved Silas backward. The blinded man stumbled, falling hard against the door of the private elevator. "Take him," Alistair ordered the 2 surviving mercenaries. "Get him out of my city. Now." The men scrambled to their feet, practically dragging the sobbing Silas into the elevator. The brushed steel doors slid shut, sealing the threat away. Alistair stood in the center of his destroyed penthouse, the cold wind whipping his dark hair across his forehead. He looked at the blood on the floor, the shattered glass, and finally, at Serena. She was covered in drywall dust, her jacket was torn, and she was clutching an empty can of bear spray like it was a holy relic. He closed the distance between them, his heavy footsteps crunching over the glass. He didn't stop until he was mere inches from her. "You saved my life," Alistair said softly, his silver eyes searching hers. "Twice, in 24 hours. I have a strict catch-and-release policy." Serena managed a weak, breathless laugh, her scientific mind finally failing to keep up with the overwhelming reality of the man standing before her. Alistair reached out, his large, warm hand gently brushing a streak of soot from her cheek. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight down Serena's spine. "I don't think I can let you release me, Serena," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "My kind. We don't form attachments lightly. When an alpha finds the one person whose presence anchors the beast, the one person who doesn't flinch at the monster in the dark, it is a bond that outlasts lifetimes." Serena swallowed hard, looking up into his intense, luminous eyes. "Are you saying what I think you're saying? I am a man of science and business, just like you are a woman of biology," Alistair said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "But some things defy logic. Gideon will come for me again. The corporate wars will turn into blood feuds. My world is dangerous, Serena. I work with apex predators for a living, Alistair," she replied, a sudden, fierce confidence blooming in her chest. She placed her hand flat against his bare chest, feeling the heavy, powerful, and entirely human rhythm of his heart. "I think I can handle 1 billionaire." Alistair's smile deepened, and he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a promise of protection, power, and an untamed future. Serena traded the solitude of the Washington logging trails for a different kind of wilderness. Beside Alistair Sterling, the billionaire Alpha King, she found a love as fierce and untamed as the wolf she rescued. Their bond, forged in blood and survival, proved that sometimes the most dangerous beasts are the ones who vow to protect us, and the greatest scientific anomaly is a destined, unbreakable heart.